So be happy to answer any questions there.
Awesome. Nicola?
Hello. Hi. Hey, my name is Nick Sahar. I'm a second-year medical student at U of T, and I'll be interning at Bain next summer, so I won't be able to speak too much about the job, but I can talk about the recruiting process and answer any questions that you have around that.
Hi everyone, my name is Rob Pilipos. Just like Nick, I haven't yet started, but I'll be joining Monitor Deloitte in September. I did my PhD and postdoc here at U of T in biomedical engineering, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Awesome. Katherine?
Hi, I'm Katherine. I'm finishing up my PhD in pharmacology at Western, and I'm going to be starting at PwC in September.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Nick as well. I defended my PhD last week in psychology, neuroscience, and I am starting next week at KPMG's People and Change practice.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we're gonna first get started with a prompt question to just initiate conversations, and then feel free, and I'll pass it on to like our audience, and they'll ask you guys some questions. So I think the topic here is not really about why consulting or anything like that, but really we want to tackle the elephant in the room, which is how hard is it for you to transition from academia to a non-academic career? Is your supervisor supportive? If they're not, how do you tackle this? And finally, I think we should all kind of answer this question, which is why consulting? Why is consulting good post, PhD or master's in various fields, whether it's professional school, whether it's molecular genetics, or whether it's psychology? So who would like to go first? Why don't we start up with you, Rob, in the middle of the panel?
Okay, let's see if I can remember all these questions. So my supervisor was, I think, supportive. Wenjin and I actually shared the same supervisor. Part of the reason for that is probably because I'm not the first in the lab to have left to enter consulting. A former member of our lab, Dave Pachin, joined BCG a couple of years before I decided to start looking into consulting. So he kind of softened the blow. Wenjin and I followed suit. So if you're looking for a good lab to join where your supervisor will be supportive, our lab is primed for that. I already forgot the second question, Wenjin.
Why consulting?
Why consulting? Okay, well, for me, I guess I always kind of knew that I knew what I didn't want to do, which was to stay in academia. So I started my master's degree from day one, knowing I'm going to complete my master's and just look for a job. I actually thought I was going to do an undergrad and just look for a job. But that was in 2008. Job economy wasn't that great, so I decided to do a master's. Day one, I said I'm just going to finish, look for a job. Halfway through, my project got interesting, so I bypassed and started a PhD, and then I said, for sure, I'm just gonna do a PhD and I'm out of here. And that turned into a postdoc, but I finally did leave. But I knew that the academia life was not for me, so the transition was always in my mind. It was in the forefront of what I'm gonna do with my career. A couple things kind of solidified that for me. One, early on in my PhD, I decided to start a business, which at the time was kind of a side hustle for me, but it grew into a business today in its current shape and form. So that was one thing, and that exposed me to the business world, and I realized that I like it. There's more out there than just science. And the second thing that kind of solidified it for me was we patented some of my PhD research, and I spent most of my postdoc trying to commercialize that work. And I enjoyed that part. So thinking about how we can take this science that I've been working on for 5-6 years and drive some real healthcare change with it, make some money with it, put it out there into the world, that process was enjoyable for me. And so that kind of really solidified my interest in business. And I always liked research. The only thing about academia that I actually liked was the research part, the whole fighting for money and funding and grants. What your professor does didn't interest me at all. It was the research that really piqued my interest. So being able to combine research and the business world was that's what consulting is all about. And so that's what drew me to consulting. Those two, I guess, life events or events during my degree that solidified the decision for me.
Okay, great. Nicola, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So I'm tackling this from a rather different perspective, coming from medicine. The question for me was not transitioning out of academia, but doing consulting versus clinical practice. And so that's kind of what was going through my mind when I was looking at consulting. And really the first time that I started looking at consulting and business in general was when I was working with a physician who had his own startup, and he was solving a problem that he had experienced in the hospital that he was working at. And he took the initiative and he took his clinical expertise and did something about it. And I found that extremely powerful because oftentimes as a physician, you're in the trenches and you're helping people one by one, but you don't get to step back and look at the system kind of from a larger perspective. And that inspired me, that got me looking into the business side of medicine, and I started exploring, and I eventually landed on consulting. And I talked to a lot of people, went to the networking events like this, did some case competitions, and was really attracted to the breadth and the depth of management consulting. So what I mean by that is the breadth, you get to explore a variety of different industries in a short period of time, but you get to dive deep into each one of them. So if you're looking at, for somebody like me who really didn't have any business background, I wanted to build a practical business kind of mindset and approach to help me tackle some of healthcare's larger problems. So the breadth and the depth was super attractive to me, and that was one of the driving reasons.
Graeme?
For me, I loved the first 12 months of my PhD, and after that, I mean, I enjoyed my project all the way through, but I really felt like after those first 12 months, the learning curve kind of leveled off, and I felt like I had learned what I was going to learn from that field or from my PI or from my lab. And for me, at this point in my career, I'm really interested in growth and development and staying on the steep part of the learning curve. And project-based work like you do for a consulting firm really appeals to me because you're constantly in that ramping up fastest, learning progression part of a project. So to me, that was what drew me to consulting. In terms of my PI, he was super accommodating with the idea of me leaving academia and going into industry, the business world, whatever you want to call it. He was not as accommodating with me, taking off for a case competition in the middle of the week. So, I mean, something like that comes with its own set of challenges, but I think I was pretty lucky in that aspect. There's another question too, which I'm blanking on. I'm good, I think.
I think you're good. Katherine, do you want to take us through your kind of journey?
Yeah, sure. I didn't really plan anything. I kind of just fell into looking at consulting. So I'm from Western, and our sort of career structure for looking at alternative careers is not as developed as it is at U of T. And so I really ended up coming to a lot of U of T events, especially the GMCA ones. And I didn't really want to keep driving to Toronto. So I started a GMCA chapter at Western, and it kind of went from there. In terms of why I decided to look at consulting, it probably started around my third or fourth year of my PhD. I'd heard the word and I was interested. And for me, academia, I sort of evaluated the data in terms of growth, kind of like Graeme. And for me, it just really wasn't there. I didn't think I was competitive enough in terms of, I'm from a smaller lab. I don't have big papers. I thought about going to the States. The average age for an R01 from the NIH is like 42. And I just didn't want to spend that much time not really growing. And I think consulting gives you the opportunity to actually develop financially and personally. And so yeah, and my PA was also pretty supportive. And I tried not to make it seem like I was spending too much time away from the lab. Yeah.
That was good. Not making it seem like you're spending too much time away from the lab is the key. So I will be interested to hear from the audience what your excuse is for taking half the day off. Anyways, so Nick, can you answer to this as well?
So my coming into consulting it's not so much like a story of inspiration. It's sort of a lesson in reality and making like tough choices. I actually like academia. If I had my choice, I'd stick with it, I think, which is sort of weird, maybe. But sort of similar to what some of you have been saying, although I do like academia, I do like research, I like teaching, lecturing, writing papers. I don't like the prospects of where you might end up. And so in terms of, financial and also like living. So it came to a point where I had to consider, work-life balance, and I wasn't willing and ready to move to like Birmingham, Alabama, or some small town, rural town, and so I had a bit of like a panic of like, well, what else is there? And it just so happened that there was a friend of mine who's doing an MBA at Rotman, and he said, "Have you ever heard of consulting, management consulting?" And of course, I hadn't. I knew nothing about the business world or industry, so it just sort of like fell into my lap, similar to what you were saying, and. At first, it was a bit scary, but then over time, and with the help of the GMCA pulling me along, I learned a lot. I met a lot of really cool people, and I realized like, oh, there are alternatives, and this is a pretty damn good one. So I, in the year and a half that I've been making the switch from PhD life to consulting and about to begin. I see that as a viable option for growth and for a career for me. Faculty, my PI, I hid it for a year. I had a really hands-off mentor, so we met like once every 6 months to discuss whatever. What were the, like? He's like, basically our meetings were, "Are you doing work? Yes. Okay, good. See you later. See you in 6 months." So it was easy for me to hide just the nature of the work, the research that I do. When I did tell him, he had no idea what this world is. Of course, most PIs, most faculty don't. They're sort of in this bubble of academia, and so there was a bit like this sense of like not shame, the word I'm looking for, but. It was a bit uncomfortable at first, but he slowly came around, and it ended up being okay. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I'll pass kind of the topic back to the audience. Do we have at this point any questions for our look at all of that? Great, good job. Yes, I'll start off with the girl up there. So I guess maybe Graeme can first answer, because I know BCG have quite a few, and then so can Nicholas. You can answer that as well, and then maybe Rob, you answer the not so. Anyways, yeah. Why won't you start?
So I think there's really two answers to this question. One is about the PhD itself, like the piece of paper and the letters after the name, and the other one is about the experiences that I gained along the way. I'm going to answer the one about the PhD itself. So I think it does help. I think it helps in terms of, when you talk to lay people outside of the academic world, they tend to be super impressed by PhDs. They don't really know what grad school is, but they know what a doctor is, and they know that, it's a lot of work, and smart people tend to have PhDs. So I think you do get a little bit of an advantage there just in terms of credibility. I think it's easy to get buy-in from the client when, it comes from Dr. Sargent rather than Graeme Sargent in some sense, and I don't usually use it, but there has been a case that I've pulled it out, and I think it helps there. And then the other place where I think it helps is with credibility internally within the firm. So for us, I mean, the way that we handle recruiting and hiring is PhDs are in one stream and undergrads and masters are in a separate one. So right off the top, you're in a smaller pool and you're competing for a different position in terms of the recruitment process. So I think it helps there as well.
Nicholas, I mean, what do you think? Does it help you with your recruitment with KPMG? Because I know they have a huge PhD crowd as well.
They do. Unfortunately, I can't speak to that directly because that's their KPMG's main S&O strategy and operations is where they do a lot of the PhD recruiting. And when I applied to KPMG, I did this sort of. Looking back, it was probably silly, but I had a cover letter that was, I'm applying to S&O, strategy, and people and change in the same cover letter. And in the interviews, they all said, this is really weird. You're applying to two positions. And I got selected for P&C, for sort of human capital consulting, which ended up being, right up my alley, with a psychology background, of course. But as it turns out, it's a much smaller team. There's about 50 of us across Canada, and I think half of that is based in the Toronto office. And I'm pretty sure I am the first PhD in that practice. So yeah, I can't really answer that directly, but I do know a few folks who I just met along the way through GMCA, through networking events like this, who are now, who have been working in KPMG's strategy practice for a year or two, and they love it. And actually, that was one of the first people I met, like a year and a half ago, was a person from KPMG, and I was like, oh, he's really nice, and maybe that's why I ended up there.
Rob or Catherine, do you guys want to speak to?
Sure. So I guess what I have to say is when I started my degree, which would have been in 2008, I didn't know anybody back then who knew anything about consulting, and I just find that within a span of 8-9 years now, every other grad student knows what consulting is. So to me, that says that there are a lot more PhDs that are being recruited into consulting firms. I think over the last decade, consulting firms have really started to understand the value that individuals with PhDs bring to the table. Because really, you pick up a lot of skills during your degree that you'd be able to use on the job. So data analysis, organizational skills, being able to perform research, sort through complex data. These are all skills that you'll use on the job. And as consulting firms have matured over the past decade, I think they've really started to understand the value of that. So you bring something to the table that people with other backgrounds, like an MBA, for example, might not be able to bring to the table. And so I think that's where the value of PhDs really comes from, and that can help set you apart from other people that are applying to the firms, maybe from a master's background that may not have had as much exposure. So I definitely do think that a PhD will give you a certain advantage in the recruiting process. And another part of that is what Graeme said, you're competing against a smaller pool of people. So yeah, I definitely do think there's value in pursuing your PhD.
Okay, yeah. So kind of like Nick, I think I'm also the only PhD in my cohort this year at PwC, and I think it did make a difference because there was no one else. So I basically PwC. I don't think they have sort of a dedicated graduate student hiring program like VCG. And so I sort of just showed up to one of the events at the Ivy School of Business and introduced myself and let them know who I was and what I did. And luckily they were interested. So I think the degree does help. I think you have to make sure that you know what you want after it. So, go or transfer or whatever and do it for the right reasons, and kind of also know, if you're going to go into the postdoc too, are you killing time or do you have a goal at the end? And I think that'll help you make a decision on what to do.
Okay, I see other hands. Yes, I'll start with you. Yeah.
I have a question. It's probably a little bit dummy, but I guess a lot of people are interested here. So before you get the offer, do you have connections already in this company before you apply, or during your apply that they sort of help you to like deliver your resume thing? And if it's a no, then what kind of key skills or activities that you think that helps you to stand out from the other candidates, and especially differentiate than the other PhD makes them feel like, okay, you are not a nerd, you are capable of the business world, basically. Yeah, so those two questions have that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
So for the first question, absolutely. You definitely want to, make your connections. You want to network with, as many consultants as you can, I would say. Try to get exposure to different people from different firms. And that's not only to help you in the application process, but it'll also help you to learn more about the firm firsthand from somebody who works there, and help you decide if the firm is right for you, because that's an important consideration as well. I honestly believe that, just like it's not specific to consulting firms, but for most companies, a hand or a foot in the door with somebody that will go a long way. And a lot of firms, I've heard, won't even consider applicants who don't have some sort of a reference or somebody that knows them from the firm. You'll get put into a second pile, the pile of people who don't have, a connection in the firm. So I would definitely try and make those connections. If for whatever reason you can't, with all the firms that you're interested in, something that will set you apart is being able to show them that you do have, that you're not just a nerd, that you do have some, exposure in the field. So picking up a volunteer consulting gig would help you out. So for example, I volunteered with Endeavor Volunteer Consulting the 6 months prior to when my recruitment season began. So I already had some exposure to consulting, and I'm sure that helped me land a couple interviews at the firms that I did get interviews. So I would try and get some exposure outside of academia that'll help you, become a more rounded candidate. And most importantly, again, I'm going to stress, try to make connections at firms with people that will be able to help you along the way. One, so that you can name drop, which I think is important in your cover letters. You want to be able to name drop somebody. But two, you might meet somebody who will help you later on with case practice. So maybe we'll get into that for the preparation process. But practicing for cases, for the case interviews, is a very important part of the application process.
Sorry, another question? Yes. You.
I guess following up on the last question, I was wondering, from the point you decided, okay, academia is not for me, I want to pursue consulting, up to the point where you got the job offer, like what was the process? Like how hard was it to get a callback? To pursue any additional certifications to get the callback? Or kind of, I guess, how difficult was it to land the job?
So Nicola, do you want to take this?
Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this depends on when you actually realize you want to go into consulting. So for me, it was probably like 9 to 12 months before I actually applied. And what the process looked like for me, initially, it was just like the first phase was just figuring out what consulting is and whether I even wanted to apply. So it was just going to a lot of information events, scheduling coffee chats with consultants, just getting my name out there and kind of like getting a feel for the landscape. And then I started figuring out that you had to prep for this case interview, and I had no idea what that was. So I started looking into that as my like second phase. That involved going to case prep sessions. I know the GMCA had like a mini case series last summer, and I just started dabbling with case interviews. And I think that it's important to get kind of exposure to that as early as you can, for not only just to be more prepared, but to figure out whether you actually like doing a case interview, because that's a big indication of whether you're going to like the job. It's kind of like a distilled down version of what you'd actually be doing. So I started doing light prep in cases, and then really the big push before the application cycle was getting my resume like up to date and polished, and writing the cover letter, and those are two like pretty important pieces that a lot of people overlook or leave to the last minute. And the reason why it's just time intensive because it requires a lot of effort to figure out how you're going to position or market yourself, and how you're going to like craft a narrative for why you want to jump from academia to consulting. And I would say like the more and more soul searching that you do during that phase, the easier it'll be to write it down in a cover letter or convey the right skills on the resume, which are super important for getting the interview. So that was all pre-interview, and then I started submitting my applications for interviews over what was last winter. And then the interview season came around, and it was hectic and intense. So you really have had to know what you're getting yourself into before you jump in, or you can easily get overwhelmed. During the interview season, I started ramping up on cases and just polishing up the other aspect of the interview, which is the behaviorals that a lot of people overlook. So that was kind of phase 3, was just the interview process, and I guess we can talk about that later on. And then you find out whether you have the offer or not. So overall, it can be like as long or as short of a process as you guys, I guess, have time for or want to make. But I definitely think like being prepared before you jump into it makes a big difference.
Thanks. I think since we're also on the topic of kind of road to consulting, like how they actually get there, why won't we have some more panelists share kind of their journey as well? How exactly did you guys prepare? What are some of the resources that you guys used? If there are any tips or tricks to networking, and so on and so forth. So Graeme, do you want to start?
I think there's 2 things you're really trying to do as a recruit. One is to get an interview, and the second is to do a good job in that interview. I think that the single most useful thing you can do in the months leading up to the interview process is to do things like volunteer engagements and case competitions, because they'll actually help you with both. They'll help you get your name out there. You might even be working with people who are at the firms that you're applying to. And you're also going to develop a lot of the skills that you'll need in the interview process itself. So if you're only going to do one thing, I think that that's probably the one I would recommend, is getting practical experience, just because it's something you can speak to in an interview, and it's also something you can fall back on during an interview if you're stuck.
That's really good. Rob, do you want to talk about your process?
Yeah. So for me, I started with the beginner's case comp in November 2015. That's where I met Graeme, actually, and he had just received his offer. And he gave me some solid advice, which was find somebody to do cases with. So I like the way that he bucketed it into 2 separate, processes. One is getting the interview, the other one is doing good at it. And they sound related, but really the preparation for each of those is different. So to get an interview, you basically have to convince the firms that you're good enough. So to do that, your resume has to be polished and up to date. I used, I'm sure many of you may have heard of him. His name is Victor Cheng. He has a toolkit on his website that's available for purchase, and he really walks you through how to write a consulting resume, because there's definitely a process for that, how to really tailor it to consulting firms. And there are many examples available in this toolkit of actual people's resumes that got into firms, and they're all rated by him. So it was a great resource for resumes. And he also has one for cover letters. So you want to make sure your resume and cover letters are polished, and you want to make the right connections at firms. And again, you do that with through case competitions. You'll jump out at firms by having your volunteer engagements. Participating in the GMCA is a great way to meet people at the firms. So that's to get the interview, and then to do well on the interviews, it's really just about practice. So most firms, their interviews will consist of a case portion and a behavioral portion, and different firms have little twists on their interviews, which those twists I find that you can't really prepare for. For example, at Monitor Deloitte, they had a case where an interview where you work with a group of 5 other people in the second round interviews, and you can't really prepare for that. So what you really want to do is just nail down the case interview portion and the behavioral portion, which will get you through the first rounds at most firms, I think. So to do that, you need to start early. I would start now. I would start in May for interviews that will begin in as early as July for the MBB firms. And to prepare, you should find, I would say, maybe 3 to 4 people who are at your level of exposure to case interviews, and hopefully you guys will grow together in your abilities to solve these cases. That was critical for myself. I actually practiced with Wen and Katherine when I was applying to firms last year. So definitely find a group of solid people that are reliable, that you can practice with, and practice frequently. I would say at least 2 cases a week if you start now. And my last piece of advice would be for the behavioral portion, don't neglect that. It's very important to firms, that portion of the interview, so it should be very important to you. They're really trying to figure out if you're the right fit for them. There's the airplane test and all this stuff. So you basically want to nail both parts of the interview. So don't neglect the behavioral, thinking that you can just do that on the fly. You should really practice both and practice them intensely.
Thank you. Katherine, do you have anything to add on?
I think it's like Rob said, if you're really serious about this, you need to start prepping now for the interviews, because I did not the first time, and I was unprepared. Like, I didn't embarrass myself in my interviews, but I could have certainly done much better, and maybe save myself some time. And so I think, I thought maybe it wasn't as hard as it was, and it turned out it was. So I would spend a lot of time prepping and networking. Like I said before, the year that I really got into it, I drove down to, I think, almost every single GMCA event in Toronto before I started up the chapter at Western. And so I did take it very seriously in terms of the networking. And I think all of my interviews came from networking. It was like maybe one cold call interview. And so that is really important. And Nick and I both went to Bridge to BCG. So if you get that opportunity, it's also a really great way to find like new friends and new case partners. And it sort of shows you this entire new group of people who are as serious or even harder working than you are. And they're also really friendly and willing to help you. And so I really took advantage of that too.
Nick, do you
I
have
can just wrap it. Summarize.
Yeah,
it all.
summarize. Please.
Plan and prepare seems to be point 1, and network and meet people. I think that can be sort of distilled down to that. So yeah, and for me, I'll add quickly, I had like a personal regimen, I guess, where Fridays were my sort of case preparation, putting my resume together, sort of job prospect days, and then the other days of the week were doing PhD work. And I was very disciplined and said, Fridays, I'm not a PhD student. I'm somebody who needs a job.
Okay, great. Let's take the question up all the way up there. Maybe you can best answer this.
So I haven't worked a healthcare case since I started. I've done 2 consumer packaged goods cases and 1 in telecom. You might think that my PhD was a complete waste of time based on that answer, and it's not true at all. A lot of the skills that you develop over the course of your PhD, like communicating complicated things and performing rigorous data analysis and coming to the correct answer, and all of those things carry over very, very well. There's a reason that consulting firms, we're representing 5 different firms here. There's probably 10 more in the city at least that are actively hiring PhDs. There's a reason for that, and that's because they found that we do better. Consulting firms love analysis, they love stats, they love numbers, and they found that PhDs are numerically a better hire than MBAs are.
Any others? Yes. You.
So I did do the first level of the CFA program, which is an extraordinary amount of work, and I'm 99% sure it didn't help me at all. But there's really no way for me to know because I haven't done the A/B testing there. No, I don't think so. I think it's certainly not going to help you land a job. Whatever you learn along the way might help you on the job itself, but I don't think it would be helpful throughout the recruiting process. I don't know if any of you guys have anything to add to that.
For me, it was just sort of like I knew nothing, like absolutely nothing, which might be a similar situation for a lot of you. Like, I mean, business. So like I brushed up on like basic business economics. Like I bought 2 books. And one of them actually turned out to be really good. The 10-Day MBA, which is sort of broken up into chapters, and one of them is strategy, financing, which I skipped. But it was actually very helpful just to like get a very basic handle on on some business concepts. And then I got like Cole's notes in economics, which I probably picked up once. But yeah, and then read get on LinkedIn, read articles, the Wall Street Journal, just different business related articles, so you can sort of, build that knowledge base. Helped me a little bit.
Yeah, the vocabulary is a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah.
For sure, helps there.
I'll add that with all these firms, you're going to get on the job training, so you're not expected to walk in with your science degree and be able to solve all these business cases, right off the bat. So there's intense training in the beginning, so you don't have to worry too much about being knowledgeable, about business. It certainly may help you during the interview process, but it's not a deal breaker. But brushing up on that kind of stuff, you don't have to take a course. You don't have to enroll in any sort of e-course. You can just read, the newspaper, read the business section, and kind of know what's going on in the business world, and that'll be enough to help you perform a little bit better during your interviews.
So just a quick add-on. One of the books that I found super helpful was called Case in Point by Mark Cosentino. It's more of a targeted book for consulting prep that includes, I think, like 95 of the relevant business terms and kind of concepts that you would need to know for your interview. And it includes like a glossary of the terminology at the end, as well as like 100 pages of him just walking through case examples and how how you would ideally solve a case. So it was super helpful. It's not too long of a book, and definitely recommend it before you ramp up your case practice.
Yes, can I have this? Yep.
In super coarse terms, a behavioral section is just what you think of as a job interview, where you come in and you answer questions about challenges you've overcome at the workplace, or a time that you led a team, or a time that you got buy-in from a hostile party, things along those lines. It does vary from firm to some extent, but usually it's kind of half of the input that they have, with the other half being a practical case component.
I would look into something called the STAR method for the behavioral section. There are a couple other variants as well, but it's basically how you should format your response to those questions. And formatting your response to the behavioral questions will help highlight exactly what it is that they're looking for. So when they ask you those behavioral questions, they're looking for specific qualities in yourself, and the STAR method helps to keep it, on point and concise, but deliver the important information.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that's a really good question. How do you sell yourself as a scientist? Yes, Katherine, please.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And so I tried to spend as much time outside the lab as possible because, you know, everyone's going to have a PhD, and what you do in it, I think, unless, you know, you have like 20 papers and some of them are nature and science papers, it's like, I know you can do it, so like it's done. So what I tried to do was, I had a couple jobs. I applied for a Thermo Fisher job where I was basically a sales rep. I did some medical writing for a company, and I really liked doing those things. So I found I liked talking to people and doing that writing component on top of the research. And so that kind of also moved me into consulting. And so I would look for as many opportunities as possible to differentiate yourself. So if you have student councils here, or you have like TA stewardships or something that shows you're involved in your research community outside of the lab, I'd try to take advantage of it.
Anyone else want to take a stab at the question?
For me, and if there's anyone, you know, from psychology or psychology-related fields or disciplines here, our you know, science is a bit different. There, you can sort of have multiple mini projects on the go at once. And I was just sort of fortunate to be connected to psychologists in the U.S. at the biggest business school, so Harvard Business School, Booth, Kellogg. And so what I did is I decided to lead a project, which was basically a review paper. And I actively hunted down these co-authors and collaborators of mine and said, hey, I want to do this. Are you on board? They said, yeah, sure, because it involves like very little work on their part because they're a faculty member. But then that became a sort of working project, and that was a line on my resume, leading a project with professors from Harvard Business School, Kellogg, and whatever, you know, and these things are honest signals that stand out. And so if you have any opportunity like that, I'd say jump on it.
Absolutely. You want to add anything?
Well, I'm not technically a scientist, so I don't.
I mean, seem to be clinician, right?
No, 2 more years.
Yeah, 2 more years. Soon enough. Okay.
Yeah, no, I can talk about how to, like, I guess, position yourself effectively. I think you have to figure out like where your like points of differentiation are. Like, let's say if you have a hobby or like a job experience that not a lot of people may necessarily have, or if you're passionate about something that that you're doing really well in, then you want to highlight that, especially on your resume or your cover letter. So an example for me was like when I entered medical school, there was really this gap between like business and medicine, where a lot of my classmates weren't really like exposed to the business side of things and how it can affect clinical care, and how like they're probably going to be more complete physicians with just knowledge of how the system works on a larger level. So I founded an interest group on campus to kind of raise awareness and get students building or thinking about kind of alternative ways to approach healthcare and medicine. And that was something that I was really passionate about over the last 2 years, and I wrote about that in my cover letter and the resume, and I think that was really helpful for the recruiting process.
Next questions, please. I will take one right here. Hi.
So I don't know if you guys applied for like more of the general school or for a specialization role, and if you guys did for more of a specialization role, how is that prepping different from one?
That's really good. Yeah. So start with
I sort of just went the generalist route, like strategy, because I was just like, this is what's in front of me, and so I'm going to do that. But I should say, and that's great. Obviously, that's not what I'm going into. I'm going into like social capital. But that said, there are tons of different types of consulting. Pure strategy is just one type, with the MBB firms. But certainly don't discount other types of consulting, especially if it can allow you to leverage your expertise. So there's marketing, there's healthcare, there's psych-related behavioral management stuff. So make sure you do some research and don't discount those. As far as the preparation, I had exposure to both types of interviews. The strategy, from the MBB firms was your typical case interview. With people in change, it was a case interview, but was tailored to a change management scenario. So think of like an acquisition or a merger, or a change in executive leadership. What are the antecedents and the consequences, and so on. So they are tailored to the specific type of consulting you would be going into.
Anyone else want to take up?
Yeah, I think the difference is more, I think I interviewed at a couple smaller healthcare firms, and so I just found every case that had like a drug in it and did all of those before those interviews. And that's what I did, yeah.
And talk about the generalist approach.
Yes.
So I think for prepping for cases for more of a general role, you want to aim to have more of like your fundamental consulting skills laid out more than like specialized knowledge, because that's what they're going to be testing. So they want to look at whether you can like break down a problem and figure out like the fastest, most efficient way to analyze it, and like do the quantitatives, and then have like a pretty high yield, like clear recommendation. So those types of like foundational skills, I think, are the most important to get down when you're prepping for a generalist role, and don't get too bogged down by like memorizing details for every industry, or just like facts and things like that, because they don't expect you to know that type of stuff.
Okay, next question, please. Yes, you. Yep. Okay, so I think that's a really good question. So why don't we all give, the date or the year that you applied, and then when you actually graduated. I think maybe that will help, right? Yeah, so those 2 dates. I'll leave you to think a little.
I'm good. So it was this event. This event was kind of my first experience with consulting, or the equivalent. It would have been 3 years ago. 3 years ago. And then that was when I first heard about it. I didn't really do anything initially. And then as I started hearing more about consulting and got to know more, I realized that it was something that really spoke to me, that it was something I was interested in. I ended up applying about 1.5 years later. So it would have been September of not that year, but the following year. I applied, I went to Bridge, and I got a job offer, and then I started in September again. So I finished my PhD the day before I started. So I finished my PhD in, I know that this is getting a little bit confusing. I heard about consulting in May of 2014. I applied in September of 2016 and got the job offer. And then sorry, I got that wrong again. I applied in September 2015, so it was 1.5 years later. Got the job offer then, and then I started a full year later in September of 2016, and that was when I defended as well.
Cool. Nicola, it's not relevant. Yeah, for you. He's still in school, but he will be doing an internship. Rob.
Yeah, so excuse me. I first got exposed to consulting in November 2015. I heard about it, a few months before that, but my first exposure was the beginner's case comp, November 2015. I started applying for jobs. I guess it would have been in 2016, July. That's when the MBB firms, or at least McKinsey, started recruiting. Interviewed at Monitor Deloitte in September. Got an offer later that month, and I'll be starting in September 2017 this year. I actually completed my PhD in 2015 and was doing a postdoc, but I decided to complete my contract for my postdoc in March of this year, specifically to give myself about 6 months off before I can start the new job. So unlike Graeme, I had plenty of time to relax before I start. But I was doing a postdoc, so it's a bit different than if you're doing your PhD.
So Katherine?
Okay, so I think I did like an actual year of recruiting in my fifth year of my PhD. And then so in my 6th year, which is this year, I did all my firm interviews, and then I got an offer in October, and then I will be starting last October, and I will be starting this September. And so I think I did add an extra year onto my PhD because I did a lot of prep and spent not a lot of time in lab, and that's pretty much why I'm doing another year of my PhD.
And
Yes.
mine is identical to Rob and Katherine, so it's the almost exact same dates actually. So I think it comes down to your first exposure to consulting, and a year later is when you'll probably be applying and interviewing, and then just the way that the recruiting cycles work with a lot of the firms. And as a PhD student in just finishing up, you'll get the offer, and then you'll have 8 months to a year to finish up, and then you begin. That seems to be the case for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I noticed we were all around a year, and that's not necessarily the norm. I think that has to do with the types of people who come to an event like this, are the same types of people who want to give back to the community and thank the GMCA for, we're a select group of people who we're all GMCA members, I assume, and want to be part of that community. There are definitely people who hear about consulting 4 or 6 weeks before their interview and end up getting the job. It definitely happens. They don't typically come to events like this. So
Damn them.
I mean, there's always a exception to the rule, right? But in general, I would say it never hurts to kind of prepare yourself for a challenging kind of interview process. Okay, we're gonna take a few more questions before we end the session. Yes, I'll take. How many rounds of interviews they did per firm, or just how many firms they've interviewed? Okay, so how many rounds of interviews are this do?
So I did 2. I applied for a summer consulting position at BCG. I was unsuccessful in that attempt, and then reapplied and got the job. So that was 2 rounds for each of those 2. And I think that's pretty typical across the board. There are firms that do more.
That was 3. But the third one was like a chat with the partner, just sort of like a very informal meeting.
Okay, next question. Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question. So why wouldn't you guys give your tips on how to network, pretty much?
Something that I found, this is like a life pro tip or whatever you want to call it. If you're sending an email to someone who maybe doesn't really care or is kind of indifferent towards you, put a question somewhere in your text, and it's quite likely that they'll answer the question. If you send them some kind of email that doesn't have a question in it, it's very, very easy to kind of read it and then just move on with your life. That's what I would recommend anyone.
Just one quick thing. One tip that I figured out and read about actually was to try and add value to the relationship from your end as well. Sometimes these networking relationships can be pretty asymmetrical, where you're always asking to meet up or asking for things. But if you guys have a common interest or something, send them an article or ask them for their opinion, or comment on I don't know, a project they've been working on. Try and be more engaging and add some sort of value / help, even though it's pretty hard to do at this stage. But I think that goes a long way.
I'll add that when you're networking, it's important to not make the entire conversation about yourself and not make it obvious that you're trying to leverage them for a job. And a good way to do that is to ask them questions about themselves, about the consultant, Don't ask them boilerplate questions. Don't ask them anything that you could Google for yourself, right? Like, what kind of work does BCG do, for example? You don't want to ask that. Make it personal. Make it about them. Ask them about their road to consulting. And my advice would be don't make it obvious, or don't try and get something out of them on the first meet. Just chat with them, show them you're a real person, have a good conversation, add them on LinkedIn and send them an email, thank them for their time. And when it comes to recruiting season, reach out, say that you would appreciate a helping hand or a coffee chat, just to reconnect. And not everybody will answer, and that's okay, right? So that's why it's kind of a numbers game. So make connections with as many consultants as you can, and don't take it personally if you don't get a 100% reply rate, because they're busy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, networking's pretty hard, or I found it pretty hard when I started, and it takes a lot of practice to be comfortable talking to someone. And like, I personally, I'm not really good at, like when there's one consultant and there's like 10 people standing in a circle, like I don't have a very loud voice. I can't really interject. I'm kind of short, right? Like I can't get my point across sometimes. So what I found was I like going to some of the smaller networking events when the firms hold sort of events at their offices. I tried to go to those and then see some of the consultants and talk to them there. And then I found that a lot of the PhD consultants would come to multiple GMC events, so I'd see them multiple times and be able to talk to them, and then you can kind of build a little bit from there too.
I'll just quickly add, don't try and be someone you're not. I think a lot of people go into these situations and put on an act or a show because they feel like this is how I ought to behave in this scenario or this situation, and that will come through. So honestly, it sounds like sort of trivial and silly, but just be yourself. And that level of authenticity that you give off in that interaction is going to be picked up on by that other person. They're gonna be like, oh, and then the rapport can then sort of be built, and the interaction can unfold naturally. I'm a psychologist saying this, so just be yourself. Yeah.
Okay, great, good advice. One last question before we wrap up the conversation. Question? Yes. Yeah. So I think from different firms, maybe you can talk about the recruitment cycle. Yeah. Nick, do you want to start first?
Yeah. So mine was again, it's a smaller practice. It's not your typical recruiting cycle. So they're sort of ongoing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So ongoing for KPMG, People and Change. Yeah. Katherine?
PwC follows pretty much the pretty strict sort of undergrad cycle kind of recruiting. Okay, so that basically means you recruit in around September, October, and then you start work the year after.
Okay. Rob, for
I think
MD?
it's pretty standard that every firm they'll follow a recruiting cycle. Usually it's in late summer, early fall. But then some firms have off-cycle recruitments as well, usually for a smaller pool of candidates. But there's usually, it's not always all year long. They're usually in cycles that take place in end of summer, early fall.
Okay, great.
So yeah, very similar at Bain. Just to add though, internship recruitment is usually in the late fall/winter. So that's when I applied. But full-time recruitment is during the summer and sometimes the spring. So there's two different cycles, and they're split by like undergrad and master students, and then advanced degrees and MBAs. So
Yeah, it's the same for us. Interviews are in August, September, and then start dates are throughout the following year.
Okay, great. So I would like to thank on behalf of GMCA and also the audience for the panelists. And yeah, we'll see you guys hopefully at the networking event.